faces, even if half masked. Many of our delegates from this trip to the COP26 are here with us, students and faculty alike. And it's a real pleasure to have this conversation, especially with our students. My name is Erik Owens. I'm the director of the International Studies program here at Boston College and a professor in the theology department. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the delegates that Boston College sent to the COP26. I'll be your host for today. This is a student-focused conversation about what their experiences were like. I'm going to start by just saying a word or two about what COP26 is, and then we'll introduce our students, and then we'll move on to some questions, and then we'll have an open conversation after that, and we'll wrap up right at noon. And at noon, there will be food available for everybody downstairs, just one floor below us in the 4th floor area, for everyone to pick up a box lunch and eat it at your wherever you'd like in this beautiful new building. So with that, thank you, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the basics of the COP26, it has this terminology and name, COP26, that is unfamiliar to many people. It refers to the Conference of Parties to the 1992 United Nations Framework for Climate Change. And the 26 indicates that this is the 26th meeting of the Conference of Parties. And the parties who confer are nation states, 197 of them, who join together to sign this agreement. And at each of the meetings, they discuss how to move forward in that framework with particular types of reductions around emissions or payments or all sorts of other things that we'll discuss today. And one thing that was especially notable about COP26 in Glasgow was that it was an attempt to put teeth on an important agreement made at the Paris Agreement not long ago, where impressive targets were set, but without enforcement mechanisms. And so there was a lot of hope around this, and there was a delayed year because of COVID, and also a lot of anxiety around bringing 20,000 people from nearly 200 countries around the world all together in a mid-sized city in England, or the UK, sorry, Scotland, where COVID was absolutely present. And so I think that'll be part of our conversation as well about the sort of logistics of getting there and what that meant. The heads of state of 130 countries were present during the first week and sometimes into the second week, and many thousands of activists, representatives from NGOs, from universities, et cetera. Boston College was one of a select number of universities who were granted observer status, which meant that we were free to move about many of the panels and meetings. Some of our students here will explain exactly what those meetings were and which ones they got to go to and didn't and things like that. But we were invited to be a fully credentialed observer in the restricted spaces that were there. But we were not parties to the climate change agreement, of course. Boston College doesn't get to vote on what the United States does with regard to its climate policy. But as we all learned, we all take back a certain measure of responsibility for what happens next as citizens of whatever country we're citizens of, as human beings and members of this community. So with us today are 5 terrific students who joined us as part of our BC delegation. Ginny Alex, who's a senior in the Lynch School, Diana Bunge, who is a senior in political science and environmental studies, Cynthia Ma, who's a junior in environmental studies, Nicola Roux, who's just completed a master's degree here in nursing, and on Zoom here, Julia Horchos is a junior in environmental studies as well. We're really delighted that all of you are here. And I wonder if we might get started by just asking some of you what your expectations were before you left, because there's a lot of unknowns about what the situation would be like, but also it's all of our first times, almost all of us here on this panel, our first times to attend a COP. So Diana, why don't you start?
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. So I think going into it, I had the expectation of sort of a UN type negotiation style room. And I was picturing like a White House sort of a vibe and people negotiating. But really after we arrived, I realized it was more of like science fair, huge, massive conference type arena. So that was definitely something I wasn't expecting. And then of course with COVID, we also weren't sure what that was going to look like in terms of capacity. And I think, you know, some of my friends here can help me out on what they were expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. Julia, do you want to pitch in from, you're behind us here?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Going into COP26, I really had a vague understanding of what I was going to be a part of. I think part of me was expecting to just bump into, pretty fancy foreign leaders. And the other half of me really thought that I was going to observe some historical climate action, which I did. But I think just going into it with all of the media coverage and, the change in US leadership, I was expecting to see some really historical climate action. Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll ask in a second whether your expectations were fulfilled on that front, especially. Nicola?
Yeah, so it's on. Okay. I really did not know what to expect at all going into this conference. I think just to echo what the other students have said, we all sort of had this vague idea of like, okay, it's a UN conference, it's this big international event, but we didn't know what it would actually look like in reality. And Deanna, I love your comparison to a science fair, because I think that's so accurate. It was, there were sort of two parts of the conference that I can sort of conceptualize. There were the plenaries and the working meetings, which were where the delegates from different organizations and countries were sort of working through the nitty gritty of these agreements. And then there was the pavilions, which I think, at least for me, and I know a lot of the week 2 students, that was where we spent a lot of our time. And this was, if you can imagine, just like a warehouse room with all of these different, I don't know how to say, like stations. Yeah, like almost like IKEA, like little rooms is how I could sort of think of it. But and that was where a bunch of different NGOs and country representatives had their pavilion, and they would put on different panels each day. So that was completely unexpected. I wasn't expecting that at all. But that was sort of the majority of my experience at COP was spent in those pavilions. Yeah, and I think just like going into it, I was really hoping, I obviously come from a healthcare and nursing standpoint, and so I was really hoping to focus on the intersection of health and climate. And I think I was able to do that fairly well. So I don't know, I think we all had a lot of vague expectations, some of which were met and some of which were not.
Yeah, Ginny and Cynthia, did you have specific expectations you brought in that you before you set foot on the ground there?
Well, kind of similar to what other students have said, I thought I was gonna be in a room where I see a lot of negotiation happen, see the diplomats on the ground working and arguing with each other. But unfortunately, that part was highly restricted. So even though we have access to move around the arena, we kind of, in a way, I feel like we're more limited to a pavilion event, which were still amazing, but it was definitely different than what I thought it would be.
Yeah, I can definitely echo a lot of that. Also, another thing, the platform for COP, like seeing the schedule and everything and scheduling out your different times, none of that was really working when we first got there. And so it was a lot of sort of just going into this big warehouse and sort of just finding what was interesting to you. And I think I had gone in expecting to just have like a really tight schedule and knowing exactly what I wanted to do. And I found that, not going in with as much of a tight schedule and having a little bit more of a loose sort of whatever catches my eye ended up being a lot more beneficial. And then also I'm in psychology. And so I was really trying to think about how what I was learning could really be tied in, because when I told people I was a psychology major, their jaws would drop. They're just like, what? Like, why do you belong here? So, and I kind of agreed with them at first. I mean, I was studying public health too. So that was a big reason why I was attending. But I was able to sort of navigate and find why there were connections between psychology and health, which is, and climate change, which was really great. So,
yeah. So I think it's good to pick up on that front on asking how you moved into the conference itself. So first of all, it had an enormous security cordon. And then once in the space, there was a huge auditorium, a huge convention center, closed plenary rooms. How did you find yourself navigating the conference, and what were some of the choices you made that seemed to pay off afterwards? Cynthia, do you want to start?
I would say the week one delegates were really helpful in sharing their resources, their maps, and then telling us kind of, in a way, I feel like we have better sense of what is going on compared to the week one delegates who are literally just thrown into a situation and not knowing what's going on, especially with COVID. So I think that's very helpful. And because my interest is more on the intersection of environmental health, climate change, pollution, so I kind of choose to go to events that are laser focused on these intersections, these nexus. And so I spend a lot of time in the WHO pavilion and the SDG 7, which is clean energy pavilion. And since my thesis was on household air pollution in rural India and about their energy transition, so I decided to attend a lot of panel events, whether they were like scientists, researchers on the subject, and then there are practitioners, public health officials, and then also entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa and in India and implementing their solutions. So I think that is very beneficial for me in terms of like relating what my thesis research could mean to a more like practical way on that. Yeah.
Excellent. Diana, what kinds of events or rooms did you get into, or encounters did you have that made an impression on you, and that you felt like were highlights of the conference for you?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, in terms of my interests, I'm doing my thesis on greenwashing and fashion and the intersection with that and fashion emissions. So going into it, I actually was able to, there's this weird like LinkedIn platform that was connected to like the COP platform, and you could see who was going if they were registered with an organization. So I reached out to the head of Fashion Revolution. She is the founder of like this huge NGO, and they publish really up-to-date stuff on brands and their emissions. Long story short, we were able to meet and have coffee. And through that, she invited me to a bunch of, unfortunately, the fashion day was in the second week, so I missed some of that, but I was able to go all around Glasgow. There were little events that were happening all around the city, like just to kind of paint a picture. The whole city, and even Edinburgh as well, was decked out in COP stuff. So really the whole city had this energy related to COP. So I was able to attend a really cool event with fashion designers based in Edinburgh, which was not part of COP, but it was kind of underground COP. And then when I was actually in the conference, I attended a lot of pavilion events. Specifically, I was interested in a lot of the CEOs that were at COP. I don't know if people know this, but this was the most attended COP for CEOs. So it was really interesting to see there was like a pavilion that was sponsored by Google to see what kind of conversations are business folks having. And my background isn't really in business, but just is by interest. So I definitely got to do more pavilion style things. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it into any of the plenary type things, which I'm sure the other students had a similar experience. So.
Yeah, Julia, do you want to go next to tell us about some of the things you attended and some of the ways that you made your way through the conference during the time you were there?
Sure. For me, I think when I first got to like the whole arena, it was just a very overstimulating kind of environment. There were so many things to do. As other students have said, the whole like calendar for kind of planning what you wanted to do wasn't really working 100%. So it was definitely a learning curve. So I really just was kind of exploring, and I think I got a very good sample of a lot of different topics of, surrounding climate change. I went to a lot of meetings at the United States Pavilion. So that was focusing more on the US effort of, what's NASA doing? What is NOAA doing? What is California doing? All of these different meetings. There were senators, Gina McCarthy was there, John Kerry. So I got to hear a lot about the US's plan in COP, which was very interesting. My other focus was really on youth involvement in climate change. So I went to a lot of meetings that were emphasizing younger voices in the climate movement, which I found to be so inspiring. They were just, you know, students of my age, but from all over the world, who got to share their stories and highlight a lot of the injustices that are taking place that weren't really, you know, broadcasted through the media, such as, you know, students from countries that had higher COVID cases, so they weren't able to get visas to attend, and all of these really interesting stories. So I think hearing that and being able to kind of get involved in a lot of those movements that I didn't know anything about was really, really incredible. I got to talk to a young boy who was my age from Nepal, and he was talking about an experience that his family had a rice farm and all of the flooding kept ruining their crops. And, you know, hearing these stories and just getting to walk around the conference and just talk to people, because again, I didn't really know what I was doing. So just getting the chance to talk to people and have conversations, I found to be truly inspiring and a really beneficial experience.
Nicola, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I echo what everyone else has said. It was very overwhelming the first day. I mean, I think like we had no idea where different pavilions were, what the different pavilions were. You just spent like on the first day, it was a lot longer to get into the actual conference space. So you just spent like 30 minutes to an hour in a line for security, and you finally get in and you're like, oh my goodness, like where am I? What am I supposed to do here? But I do think throughout the week it got a lot more manageable. And like we have all said, we spent a lot of time in the pavilion room. I was actually able to get into one of the plenaries, which was a really cool experience. And I'm glad I got to sort of see that. I went to the Gender Day plenary. And so in the plenaries, they aren't necessarily doing any negotiations, but rather sort of presenting about like what has come out of the working groups, or perhaps like different countries' commitments. And so that was really interesting to see a lot of like really big names and delegates from all different countries all in one room. That was a really cool experience to be part of. So definitely glad I got to do that. But I would say that wasn't necessarily like it wasn't the most impactful thing. It was really cool, really interesting. But to echo what Julia was saying, really having conversations with folks really who are most affected by climate change issues was the most significant of experiences for me.
Great, thanks. Ginny, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. I went to quite a few of the pavilion things. I popped into a plenary at one point. They were talking business strategies about, honestly, I don't know what. It went right over my head. I was like, this is good, but I could go back to the pavilions and I'd be totally fine. I definitely was looking a lot at the health pavilion, spent a lot of time there. There was this one sort of, I don't even know exactly. It was in the Action Hub. And it was about Formula E. So like trying to make Formula One cars into a more, a different option, more ecological, and doing sort of electric cars. And so that was a really interesting thing, something I, honestly had no interest in before. But when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is something cool. And they had the car out in the middle of the hallway. And it just caught my eye, and it was something that was really interesting. And then I also went to a event called I have to read it. The Climate Justice and Burgeoning Mental Health Crisis. And that was something I kind of walked in. I was like, okay, it fits in my wheelhouse. And all of a sudden they were talking about climate migrants, and that's what my thesis is on. And I was just like, wow, I walked right into something that just ended up being the most fitting thing, and talking to people who had really, really intense experiences with climate and being moved, and how that impacted their mental health. That was a really powerful and impactful session for me to be at. And then, beyond that, like thinking about the security lines and things like that, and testing for COVID before, we had like at-home swabs that we had to do every day, and then upload it onto the National Health website. We found all the good spots for free coffee. That was really big. Given jet lag, it was like really great. But those were definitely experiences I didn't expect to have, but things that ended up being really notable and exciting. So yeah.
Yeah, to step up just one level and give you guys a little picture of why it felt unclear about what was happening sometimes. There were official tracks of negotiations that were closed to non-parties. And then there were a million different side events inside and outside of the convention center. And there were maybe 60 or so pavilions, room size, things about this size of this room set up, sponsored by nation states or coalitions of nation states or foundations or NGOs of other sorts that would host events, sometimes all day, every day for 2 weeks. So you may have 50 times 8 or 9 events a day all over, plus other things happening in plenary rooms and negotiations, and then things happening beyond the parameters of the actual conference in the cities and things that Diane mentioned before. And none of them were on a centralized platform or digital space that allowed us all to see everything or search by keyword or anything like that. So there was a lot of word of mouth and a lot of running back and forth to places. And I heard this is going to happen at this. And it added a large measure of excitement, I have to say. I'm not sure that efficiency was the number one thing that was a result of it, but it lent an air of festival kinds as a way, even though, of course, it wasn't all joyful. There was a lot of anger and angst, and there were large protests outside on the midday, the Saturday in between the 2 weeks. There were 100,000 people who marched through Glasgow. There were daily protests inside of the conference and outside of the conference. And the protest experience was very clearly a big part of the whole experience. And I wonder if you guys had reflections on the sort of protest side of things that was outside of the actual programming.
I was just going to say one quick thing too, in terms of like what you were just saying, that definitely I think coming out of it, instead of having this negotiation style, like if I could do it again, I would say just pay attention to people around you and the conversations people are having. I mean, everybody there is like very high credentialed, is very much in the industry and have so much to offer. So even just like Julia and I, like a fun anecdote is we had lunch next to the director of the International Energy Agency. And it was like, oh, okay, hi. And you're like sharing a burger or something. Like it was so interesting. But in terms of the protests, I do think there was a lot of security. And so this one night, I left the conference and we knew that I like scheduled my time to leave because there were thousands of people that we couldn't really get back to where we needed to stay. So even just kind of being aware, like looking at social media, seeing what's going on, just so that you know like what's happening. But I walked past a protest and I didn't see Greta, but I saw a lot of other people and it was definitely really inspiring to see.
Julia, did you want to, I want to make sure your voice is consistently heard here. Did you have any thoughts on what happened outside of the space or any of the sort of other aspects of the experience?
Yeah, I would say that Deanna and I were actually interviewed by a reporter, and he was focusing on highlighting youth voices inside the conference and outside of the conference, and kind of drawing some, differing points of what are we doing as members of COP26 versus what are students our same age doing, outside protesting. And to that, I would just say both are incredibly important, because I think you need young voices in these rooms. Not that, we were actually in the rooms, but I do think that that's really important to get young people in decision-making rooms. But then on the same, on the other side of the coin, you really need people to kind of draw attention to the media. And that comes from getting, 100,000 people out in the square in Glasgow and, seeing these powerful signs, because again, a lot of those people, if they had the ability to be in COP26, they would be there, but they don't have that privilege. And, they took to protesting to kind of have their voices heard. And I think when I saw that, it was a good reminder, because, after being there for like 6 hours and, you know, running back and forth from pavilions and pavilions, you got a little bit kind of lost and exhausted towards the end of the day. So, you know, coming out of the conference and being in Glasgow and seeing all these protests was a really inspiring reminder that what we're doing is really important. And, you know, it takes everyone from all different angles to really draw the attention that climate change deserves in the media. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think, and in addition to a lot of young activists there, I think for Glasgow, hosting COP26 really is an opportunity for them to raise awareness across all generations. I remember the first day I landed in Glasgow, I was talking to the taxi driver and he's aware of it. And then there's all the signs in the subway station, all over the street. And also the last day when Ginny and I was walking toward the security area, like there were old lady giving out coffee cakes, and then there were flyers, and they were like, hey, can you like please pressure Australia? I was like, I mean, I'm not in the room, but I really appreciate your effort. And I think that really showcased how much it's not just the young activists. There are a lot of people, everyone from different background, generations, and perspectives have passion for this issue. So yeah, that's very inspiring.
There were official tracks of recognition for Indigenous peoples and young people and labor and women on site, but also there were groups that were clearly not well represented there, even if they were in name. Places in the world and types of peoples and generations that weren't at the table. And those protesters served as a bridge in a way and an inspiration for all of us to keep them in mind. And that was super powerful for me as well. So this provides a nice pivot to think about what are the ways that, or what are the things that you've taken away from that experience? What are the inspirations you've received, or the angry recognitions that have settled upon you, or the lessons you may have learned that you're now wrestling with now or moving forward with? Ginny, do you want to start?
You know, this has sort of been my tagline now that I've gotten back. The conference was very important to be at, very important in terms of just being able to take in everything and really learn and just sort of sink your teeth into the issue. But what really happens and where the change happens is when you leave that conference. Like, everyone agrees at the conference, you know, there's no, you know, opinion that's really differing, at least in the pavilions that we were at, things like that. Everyone sort of is on the same page. Everyone wants to enact change. But then what happens when you go home, like, those are the moments that really matter. And so I've been thinking about that in terms of, you know, where the rubber meets the road is when I come back to BC and sharing things like in this panel, or you know, talking to people from the newspaper or whatever it is. That's when it really matters, and that's when you can really make the change, is sharing the experiences you've had outside, or with the outside people. So that was something that I thought was a really big and important thing, just general takeaway. And then sort of in my own personal life, it's inspired me to sort of look at how I can consider climate change in more aspects of my life, whether it's, you know, looking at how it could impact my thesis and changing around my thesis to focus more on climate change and the mental health effects of climate change, or just sort of how I live my life, and just sharing things with my friends. And, you know, it's been a really, really special experience. So, yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead, Cynthia.
And I think my biggest takeaway is, again, related to more of like my research interest, my thesis on like environmental health and climate change. Because I guess before going to the conference, and since I'm an environmental studies major, I've been frustrated. I was like, this is climate change. This is a big problem, global problem. Everyone should work together. Like, there's the solutions right there. How come no one does anything? But I think really after going through a lot of the pavilion event and hearing people like their experiences and having conversation really make me realize and understand that climate change is a global issue with very local implications. So I was able to talk to this activist from Kenya, actually Nigeria, at the airport, and I was asking, oh, what's the climate change implication for your country? And he was like, oh, you know, for the northern part, it's about like more like drought. And then for the southern part, it's like flooding. I was like, oh, like I didn't even know that there were these nuances. So I think really that my biggest takeaway is like it is a global issue that needs collective, collaborative actions, but you really need very nuanced and individualized, specialized solutions for like situations in the local area to make sure that it really caters to people's need, because one solution that works in one area might not be able to transplant into like another area, and that's just not going to work if we just try to find like a one size fit all thing. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Julia, do you want to go next?
This might sound like a little basic, but I think my greatest insight is really just how much energy, commitment, cooperation, and precision is really needed to draft a successful agreement. And more importantly, how one country's or one party's stubbornness or kind of neglect of international diplomacy can hold back progress for everyone. And you know, I don't want to minimize the accomplishments of Glasgow and a lot of the, you know, both the pact and different things that were announced. I do think it's important to emphasize that like there's still so much that needs to be done. And it became pretty evident to me that a lot of countries are simply not pulling the weight that they need to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius and keep that within reach. And as an environmental studies student, you know, we hear this message in classes and on the news so often, but we also learn, you know, what are good mitigation and adaptation strategies for climate change. We learn on the flip side what needs to be implemented to kind of help, you know, save the planet, just point blank. And it was just kind of frustrating seeing COP26 fail to bring about like the strongest possible agreement. But nevertheless, the whole experience has made me really excited to get involved in climate policy. And I think most importantly, it's made me aware of how much effort is needed to achieve success in these agreements. And, you know, like it's really, really tedious. It's a hugely tedious process. And, you know, all of these members are fighting over one word in this agreement. You know, the last day of the conference was all held up whether the term like phase out coal versus phase down coal should be in the final agreement. And, you know, that's super duper important. And I think it's easy to learn about it in class, be like, oh yeah, this is what you need to do. This is what needs to be implemented. But once you're at a conference of this magnitude and you really get to experience that, I think that's when you really become aware of how much effort and how many people and all of these different pieces that need to align to create success. So that's something.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Nicola?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of reminded of a conversation that we all had in the second group at lunch, sort of on the last day, where we were talking about this idea of like engaging stakeholders and what does that really mean, and are we actually doing that at these COP meetings? So I felt like that was a phrase that was thrown around so often in plenaries, in pavilion presentations, but was there really meaningful representation and participation from the most impacted communities? I think that was something that we were all sort of thinking about and discussing, and sort of how to bridge the pavilions with the plenaries and the negotiations. So I felt like I gained so much valuable information and insight from attending the pavilion presentations and panels, and I wonder sort of how that was translated into the decision-making process in these negotiations that were going on. Because I think for me, the most meaningful part, like I said, was talking to Indigenous people, talking to young people, talking to climate refugees who are really affected on the ground by these issues. And I think that sort of circles back to what Cynthia was saying about these hyper-local solutions and how can we integrate those into this like bigger discussion and bigger negotiations. So yeah, I think that was sort of the biggest takeaway for me is centering people and centering communities is the only way to really have meaningful climate action.
Thanks. Diana?
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing what everyone's saying, it was really inspiring to see everybody else who's involved in this process, other than just like the nation states and the leaders and stuff like that, just to be around people who care about the issue just as much as you do was definitely a big takeaway for me. But then also kind of what Julia was saying, we had the conversation with the news reporter. We just sort of talked about that within like our lifetimes in the next 20 years, you know, that's what matters the most, like in terms of the timeline for this. So just kind of thinking about like how old I'm going to be when that is. And so what's going to be my role in the next 20 years? And, you know, personally, I am pursuing this professionally. And I'm going to get my master's in environmental science and policy next year. So that's definitely like the personal route I'm going. But even then, you know, I'm going to be a junior professional. And so what kind of a voice am I going to have in this process? And how can I take this experience with me going forward? You know, I think it's really interesting to see how young climate activists are talking about this, and just saying, you know, to hell with the credentials, like my voice matters, our voice matters. So just kind of pushing forward and really pushing for change, I think is something I'm taking away.
Well, thank you so much for all this. This is really insightful. Let's open, we have 20 minutes left. Let's open for questions or conversation or small speeches disguised as questions. Yeah, Kurt, go ahead.
I think you mentioned that you didn't get access to the kind of focus of the COP26, the negotiations. What was the reason? Because officially with our batch, we were allowed to attend to most of these. Some were really closed, and I indeed was in some of these. Was it organizational? Was it already full? And
I think personally, I saw that most of them were happening early in the morning. And so I always sort of like missed in terms of leaving from Edinburgh to Glasgow and then going through security. And then additionally, there were a lot of restrictions with COVID that I somehow just never was able to make it in.
For week 2, a lot of the high level negotiation are kind of over with like the World Leaders Summit, and since the G20 was before that, so it sounds like a lot of the actual negotiations would happen before the COP negotiation happened. So it seems like it was more of like people have a plan and they're just like working through a timeline and make sure they meet the they have like a, I don't know, like media schedule and like, okay, we're gonna release this statement on this day. So things weren't what we expected before we go in. But also about the access restriction, I was actually able to sneak into one of the strategy meeting, which I'm not supposed to. It seems like the guard just didn't check my badge and I was just in there. And it was the like-minded country bloc, which is pretty much like a coalition with developing country, mostly G77 and some African countries. And for them, that was more of like a daily debrief meeting slash strategy meeting. It was like what they want going into the second day of negotiation, because afterward in the morning they have the G77 session, and then I think they have the entire negotiation with all the country afterwards. But with the moment I was in the meeting, I realized I'm not supposed to be there because they were talking about very detailed like clauses of the agreement, and then I didn't fully understand what was going on, but it sounds like they were going more into the climate finance. That was more of the focus of negotiations, especially during week 2, under my impression. But then at the next morning, when I was trying to go into the G77 meeting, I was unfortunately said, no, you're only an observer, and that was the meeting restricted to like the party delegates. So yeah, that was my little, yeah.
Anyone else have a sneak in story? Okay, good. Other questions? Yeah, Professor Dees.
I think your last question got at this, Eric, but I was curious if there were any surprises, like what would most surprise you in the end that you learned that you didn't expect about the process or the effects of climate. And then just one brief comment, it's probably my bad hearing that Eric may have already mentioned this, but at the end of most days, the president of the COP had a briefing. That was really cool because the NGOs had a specific voice, labor had a voice, female-led organizations had a voice. And then secondly, there were opportunities to sit in on the negotiations themselves, very few in the same room, but there were parallel rooms, right, that were set up. So you felt like you were in the negotiation. And that was a nice opportunity.
So surprises?
Yeah, I think something that I was surprised to see represented so heavily, and I don't know that I should be surprised, but I guess I just didn't expect it to be so present at the COP, was this sort of mental health element, and then gender-based violence was a huge discussion at this COP, especially as it pertains to climate, refugees, and internally displaced peoples. And that's something that I care very deeply about and am interested in academically and personally. So I think that was like a really pleasant surprise for me to see that was a big part of the conversation at this COP. I don't know if anyone else has surprising.
I was at that same session with Nicola, and we both had sort of aligning interests on that. So that was definitely a really great, fun surprise. And definitely really meaningful for me because that was like the only one that seemed to encompass everything that I was studying. Like just the only event I had been at. And so it just felt like this aha moment where I was like, wow, this is really understudied and really something that I could continue to go into and, explore further. And I'm trying to think about other surprises. I mean, we ran into lots of people. We got pushed over because we were like, was it Nicholas Sturgeon?
Well, no, it was Nancy Pelosi's like
Nancy
security
Pelosi.
detail. Yeah, we were all sort of sitting having lunch in the hallway one day, and I guess a big like crowd of suits came walking towards us, and we were all like, oh, I wonder what that is. And then you see Nancy Pelosi in the center in her like red pantsuit. So that was pretty cool, just to like be in the same, like breathing the same air, I guess, as like some of these folks.
That was a memorable visual to a very petite woman in bright red power striding through a conference with about 40 people in black suits around her, security and delegates and observers and journalists and everyone moving through. Just you could feel the sort of wave of, I don't know if it's power, but something like that that felt as people like that move through the space is memorable to see. Yeah, Julia, how are you doing back there?
I'm good.
Do you have any surprises to share?
Yeah, one thing I was just thinking of is, I know we're talking a lot about how it was difficult to get into negotiation rooms, but one reflection I do have is that I made it into a couple of them towards like the tail end of my week in Glasgow. And to be honest, once you got into them, maybe I was just in meetings that weren't super interesting, but they were just very nitty gritty. These people were focusing on obviously like the terms of these agreements, and it was super important, but just being someone for observer point and status, it was very like, it was almost like broadcasted. There's like an MC for one of the plenary events, and they had special speeches and stuff, and it was very interesting and a very cool experience. But I found the meetings that were more conversational had just a lot more impact and value, at least for me and my experience in Glasgow, that just having conversations with people and being lost in these pavilions, like I got to track down John Kerry and I had like a 2-sentence conversation with him, and just like the more experience of like being present was really interesting. So after all this effort trying to get, sneak past security and get into these rooms, I found that I had just as much, if not a better time, kind of just hanging out inside COP and going to these meetings that were more specialized in sustainable development, wilderness. I went to one meeting that was just, what country was it? I think it was like a Thailand information session. And that was just cool, to hear these different stories. So that's something surprising, I would say.
That's great. Thanks. I know we have a few other questions, one from Praveen, and then we'll come over to, yeah, go ahead, Greg.
So this is from Professor Praveen Kumar in the chat. He said, if you had the opportunity to attend COP27 this year, what would you do differently?
Well, I guess since the COP27 will be in Cairo, Egypt, I think it will be I definitely want to go to more event that's focused on the global south, sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, where I feel like a lot of the developing country have done a lot of media coverage, advocacy work at the pavilion event. But then going back to what Nicola said, we were wondering how did that conversation translate into the agreement. So I definitely want to focus on that, since that's one of the few COP, if not the only COP that's happened in Africa. I think that would be very significant.
Any other ambitions for if you were able to get a ticket to COP27?
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I would definitely do more homework beforehand to see who's going and when are they speaking. Because there were, interestingly, so the New York Times had their own like COP setup, and everyone who was like really, really cool and interesting had access, or like were gonna speak at that setup. But to get in was like $1,000 plus, and it was very, very exclusive. So I would try and sort of maybe see, there were a lot of things online as well, which was hard to navigate. So definitely do my homework, network in advance, and see, try and plan and see who was going and when, so I wouldn't miss anything.
I also think, I agree, homework for sure, something that I think could have really benefited me beforehand. But if I were to be able to go again, I think I would want to capitalize on the connections I already made at the COP26. I was really blessed to be able to meet a lot of really interesting people. And so I think making those connections and following up with those connections, seeing what they're doing now, that's something that I think would be really interesting to sort of be able to continue on that. And that's something I can easily do, not from COP27, but if I were able to, that would be something that I would definitely look forward to.
Professor Landrigan, why don't you take our last question? And then I saw Professor Hinsdale was asking to make sure that she had the names of our students. And so I'll have you reintroduce yourselves again at the end of our segment for everybody who's watching online. Professor Landrigan.
Thank you, Eric. So my question is really a direct follow-up to the previous question. So as you know, we're planning that BC will get accreditation status again and send a delegation, hopefully of equivalent size this year, and planning meetings are already underway. In fact, there's one tomorrow. So my question is, what could Boston College, the institution, you guys talked about doing your homework, which is clearly important, but what can the program in Global Public Health and the Common Good, what can the Environmental Studies program, what can the Schiller Institute, what can BC in general do to better prepare next year's delegation to maximize the experience?
Question.
I can sort of jump in. I would definitely say I was fortunate enough to take Professor Deese's class and sort of understand like what COP is, but there's a lot of language and terminology that can be confusing. So even going into planning what your week is like, understanding more of the nitty gritty of what are they going to discuss and when, going into COP, knowing the themes, because each day had a theme, was definitely really helpful, but just having the background and understanding of like the legacy of COP and what this one is aiming for, its goals, its themes, etc.
I can kind of jump in. I think that one of the best things about this panel here is that we, and actually also all of the professors, is everyone came from a different discipline. So we had people thinking from so many different realms. And I think that was something definitely to continue to do. And just to continue to try and get a really broad reach of people, because that makes the conversation when you get back to BC and even at the conference a lot more meaningful and powerful. So I think that's definitely something to continue on. But even if it's like a class that could be taught alongside going to COP or prior to going to COP, that might be something that could be beneficial, whether it's the history or things that are going to be discussed there. then again, that might get a certain draw of people, and then you don't have that sort of broad reach, but it's kind of, a toss up on that.
Any other suggestions for Boston College?
I would kind of echo what Deanna was saying about doing your homework, and also Professor Deese's class. I know we did in that class, we were assigned delegations. We, basically had 2 classes where we were basically doing like the Paris COP. And that was very helpful with like learning terminology for the COP. But one thing I would highlight is kind of going off of Praveen's question as well, is that after COP, when I came home, I got into contact with a lady who's in Christian Life Community, which is an organization I'm in on campus. And she works with the Jesuits for eco-Jesuits and was at COP26 and was really talking. I got to talk with her when I came back about the importance of what the Jesuit network is doing within climate change globally. And I think having BC as a Jesuit institution, there's so much potential to really combine, all of these different disciplines that we all have, and then integrate it with, a common call for Ignatian justice, social justice, and all of these different factors of ethics, because that's something that the BC delegation has that a lot of NGOs don't really have that common root. So I think that's just something to keep in mind for, future planning.
That's excellent. Thank you. Professor Landigan, do you want to follow up?
Just a quick comment that follows up on that last point you just made about the Jesuit network. So what we're planning, we're still in the early stages. We have a lot more advanced planning time this year than we did last year, which was all, as you know, last minute and catch as catch can. But part of that planning is that we're talking about 2 side events. One is to introduce a book to which Professor David Worth contributed a big chapter, a book on. It's a book for lawyers. It means you need a great deal of patience to read it, but it's a book on the history and structure of these kind of negotiations. And the second thing, which is directly relevant to your point, is to actually try to have a side event that talks about ethics, social justice, the Jesuit network, Laudato Si, and it's still in the talking stages. But we recognize that the ethical dimension of this, everybody gets caught up in, is it phase out or phase down? Is it coal or is it oil? Is it a comma or is it a semicolon? And they ignore the fact that there's this huge moral and ethical dimension of this that just gets sort of set aside as the elephant that's ignored. So we're hoping to change that.
Terrific. Thank you. Greg, did you have a last wrap up?
Yeah, so Professor Hinsdale had said that she didn't catch the names of the students, but if the student who had reported on climate migrants could say a bit more on which countries were represented in those conversations, and the same for which countries were represented in the conversations about gender violence and its relation to climate change.
Yeah, I could say a little bit more on that. I think from what I'm remembering, Southeast Asia was, I wish that I knew which country specifically, but Southeast Asia was represented specifically when talking about climate migrants. We went to, and I think Professor Deese as well went to this event on like internally displaced folks in Southeast Asia specifically. So that was a big area of conversation. And then I think gender-based violence, from what I remember, we had a couple of folks, I think from Bangladesh, and then there was a woman there from Kenya, I think.
Organization that goes and does a lot of like on the ground work. So it was a nonprofit that also worked with them. So it was a combination of people who had been directly affected and people who were seeking to aid. So that was really interesting too.
I sat in on a SDG pavilion, had a meeting also of representatives of foreign ministers of low-lying islands that were quite interesting and quite moving with pathos among all participants as well, and beyond urgency into pathos as well. That was quite moving to attend as well. We need to wrap up, but of course this conversation will continue in all sorts of venues on campus here, in our classrooms, downstairs for lunch after this, in all of our other public and private spaces. We've all come to understand how important every aspect of climate action is, whether it's through scholarship or through citizenship or through community or through our lifestyle, many other ways as well. So thank you to our panelists, especially Ginny Alex and Cynthia Ma and Julia Horchos in the back, hello, Nicola Roux and Deanna Bunge. Thank you so much for being here. All of you ladies, I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here in the audience. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.